Welcome back, everyone. I'm your moderator for this session. My name is Derek Wilmot, and we have Rebecca Black as our Q&A navigator, and Rachel Rosekind will be our chat monitor for this session. Welcome to the next session of the Abolitionists' Visions and Intersections, a summit hosted by the American Library Association Social Responsibilities Roundtable here, also known as SRRT. SRRT believes that libraries and librarians must center social responsibility by recognizing and helping to solve social problems and inequities to work for the common good. To enable captions, click More in the bottom right of the screen, then click Show Captions. Our session this afternoon will be recorded, and the recording will be available via the SRRT website by early April. Please keep your cameras and mics off unless you are a presenter. Please be respectful and extend care and compassion to yourself and others. This includes using person-first language when posing questions or sharing information in the chat. Please refrain from using dehumanizing language such as prisoner, convict, or ex-con, and instead use language which emphasizes the personhood of these populations, such as incarcerated person, justice-involved individual, or justice-impact person, for example. This session title is designated Designing for Yes in a World of No, and our presenters are Stacy Lynn Burnett, Ryan McCarthy, and Grace Cope. Full bios for all our speakers for this session and all our other sessions are available on our website. Use the Q&A feature to pose questions and reserve chat to relay any tech issues, resource share-outs, or appreciation for our panelists. We hope to have a brief window for Q&A at the end. If you do not get to pose your questions live, we encourage you to reach out to the presenter or presenters if they have shared contact or organizational information in the chat. And with that, I will turn this over to Ryan, Grace, and Stacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. I'm so grateful to be spending this afternoon with you all today. I have to tell you that the people in this waiting room, I'm actually really nervous. You guys are some real all-stars. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to show up for the librarians here and everyone who works in education in prison and making information available. My name is Stacy Burnett. I manage the JSTOR Access in Prison program at JSTOR, and I have an MBA in sustainability. But what really makes me qualified to speak here is that I lived in an information desert, prisons, for 7.5 years, and it's my privilege to work on matters related to information literacy and to make information available to people who are incarcerated. I'm going to now have Ryan and Grace give a brief overview of themselves, and we will dig right into the presentation.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly, I'm Ryan McCarthy. I'm a software engineer. I work with JSTOR Labs, primarily on the Access in Prisons project. I work with Stacy a lot, which is great. Yeah, I'll pass it off to Grace to introduce herself, and then we'll get going.
Hi, everyone. I'm Grace. I am a user experience designer at JSTOR Labs. Also, while I don't have the daily privilege of getting to work with Stacy and Ryan, I get to work on bigger ideas and get to put things together like a presentation on this. So excited to be talking together all today. And I'll hand it back to Stacy.
Thanks so much. So for those of you who don't know, JSTOR is part of Ithaca, but it's distinct from Ithaca. And I work in the lab within JSTOR. We are a nonprofit with a mission to improve access to knowledge and education for people all over the world. And we believe that education is key to the well-being of individuals and society. And we work to make it more effective and affordable. Next slide, please. So JSTOR Access in Prison currently is available in more than 1,000 prisons and jails across the United States, and an additional 50 outside of the United States, predominantly in Australia and some parts of Europe. But and out of the 500,000 people who have access to JSTOR, half of them have their access is via the offline version, which requires typically a librarian to go and pull information and by hand, and then it finds its way inside of the facility. It's very old-fashioned, but in many places that don't have access to the internet inside, it's the only option for self-directed research. Next slide, please. So JSTOR is kind of in the middle between DOCs and higher ed programs. And we often have to navigate the very precarious ways that, our goal is to get as much information inside as possible, while the DOCs are accustomed to restricting information because new ideas can be scary in those places to the administration. And stakeholder management is super important to try to show that there are overlapping interests in making information available inside those spaces. And it's sometimes really hard to get everyone on the same page, because what makes JSTOR Access and Prison really cool to librarians actually terrifies a lot of DOCs. And as Ryan has often said, it's easier to get yourself inside a prison than it is to get information inside of a prison. Next slide, please, Ryan. So this is what most people think prison libraries look like who've never been inside of one, on the left. And on the right is what many prison libraries look like. And it's very challenging to get recreational reading material in that you want to read, let alone scholarly information that's vital to an equitable college education. Next slide, please. And this is what most prison libraries are starting to look like. And this is a tablet that is JSTOR actually running on a tablet inside. And tablets are available to more than 95% of people who are incarcerated, but the technology tends to be old, glitchy, small. The content review is highly centralized. And most of the time, people who are incarcerated have to pay to review content. One thing that I would like to alert for this audience is that JSTOR is always free for the people who are incarcerated. And we worked really, really hard with tablet providers and DOCs to ensure that there was no monetization of the content happening. So there are no downstream costs to libraries, colleges, DOCs, or most importantly, the people who are incarcerated. As we were designing JSTOR Access in Prison, we thought about the user in mind. And it was a little bit challenging because we don't often have direct contact with people who are incarcerated who can give us feedback. So we had to employ someone like Grace, who can help us design interfaces that are user-friendly, to design the interfaces that are user-friendly, and that can enable us to transfer information quickly with a population that tends not to have a high level of digital literacy because of the ways that they find themselves coming into prison. And the absolute, you think it's an information desert, it's a technology desert too. So I am now going to turn it over to, I think, Grace, to show us some of the design tricks to get DOCs to kind of say yes.
Next slide, please. So like Stacy mentioned, my role as a designer on this team and any team is to be thinking about how to help folks use any site to navigate their distinct challenges and needs with ease, specifically to reduce the barriers and errors, mainly human errors, on the road to accomplishing a task like accessing an article. And that's for anybody, a student, researcher, or teacher. I like to think of it as like walking stacks at libraries, public or other. The more efficiently that someone can navigate a web interface, the sooner the knowledge is in their hands. So some of y'all might be familiar with this page or have conducted your own searches on JSTOR. I'm gonna walk through a few of those design principles that Stacy mentioned, primarily from the view of this JSTOR page. That have probably helped us all search for something we're interested in. So in my own free time, I'm really curious about building ethics around teaching and facilitation and pedagogy. So a search that I might make on JSTOR is searching for content or commentary around a seminal book such as Pedagogy of the Oppressed, to read in my own time. So as I would gear up to kind of make my search and start foraging for information, the role of the designer is to make sure that my prompt to the ether follows what we call having a heavy information scent, which is this idea of if people decide where to go next on a page by following those breadcrumbs, that the next page will actually answer their question, and do that pretty quickly. So if I were to enter my search, next slide. The first part of my journey is this results page. The first thing I can notice here is that there are different sections that might be calling my attention on what to do next. So using larger text font and grouping related functions helps me as the user to understand the structure of the content on this page at a glance. For example, seeing that the refined results section and my total results being 18,927 results are kind of at the same visual level, can help me to quickly decide if I'm interested in further refining my results on the left-hand navigation, or if I kind of just want to jump into the meat of it. And this page is structured to match the way that I, as a high vision and Western English reader user, would scan a page. So there's always a lot of cultural competency or change going into how we're going to approach different pages. But the idea of me navigating this page is this idea of reading gravity, like where does my attention actually fall? Next slide, please. So this concept also in user experience design is known as the Gutenberg principle, which is just that Western readers who are relying on their vision to consume content are going to be evenly kind of scanning a page, starting at that top left, that number 1, moving over to number 2, to the top right, to the bottom left, which is a little weaker point, and to the bottom right, which is a typical kind of terminal end area. By loosely following those quadrants, when I'm thinking about designing a page, it's easy for me to identify what's searched, and again, make that choice of if I want to be filtering results or scanning more titles. Which would be fitting like my mental model of how I'm reading, what I expect to consume, and in my case, heavily influenced by Western media and reading newspapers, for instance. Next slide. It's also really important to note I'm talking about visual hierarchy here, but this is something that we want to achieve as designers across the spectrum of high and low vision users. As designers, we get to work with developers to make sure that hierarchy that I'm talking about and that reading gravity is reflected in the structure of the page for folks who might be using assistive technology, such as keyboards or screen readers. And the way that we can do that is design the appropriate structure and tab order of the page to help folks jump through those sections the same way that I would. So here on the screen, we can see what it looks like. I took a screenshot of someone using a voiceover screen reader assistance to navigate to that desired kind of outcome. Next slide, please. Another key design element that makes me kind of quickly and efficiently able to browse through things is consistency. So as I'm browsing those certain elements on a page, such as these journal articles, the consistent repetitive units of structure here, which are content type, title, author, the description of the keyword, and those consistent actions that are repeated to download, save, and cite, help me create a consistent expectation of how the information would continue to be organized as I'm navigating this first page, or if there's up to 18,927 results, being able to move through all of that content. Next slide. Maybe an obvious tool to wield, but when I'm trying to say, hey, look over here for what you want to do, particularly for folks with high vision, visual cues like icons and color help us emphasize the primary action that we can suggest to a user, but which, like Stacy mentioned, oftentimes we are able to validate during user testing, sometimes not as much. So as soon as I, let's say, found an article that I was interested in, the clear bright red download button, which is also at the top of those 3 options of buttons, is kind of a clear prompt for me. Using contrasting colors helps encourage a user or myself to take that action versus kind of the 2 black text grayed out outline buttons. And in design, we call these call to actions or CTAs, where that top primary action is a primary CTA, and the one that is less emphasized, a secondary CTA. So having different actions visually weighted helps us give those clear suggestions to folks who are quickly navigating a site. And you can imagine that if all 3 of these buttons were bright red, there would be maybe an additional cognitive choice for me to think, especially as a new user, someone new to the site, which one would I want to choose? And it could also potentially clutter up the site pretty quickly. And again, having clear and short names of the buttons that are paired with icons here, download, save, and cite, helps us encourage that information sent to other users who might be looking for specific ways to interact with that content. But again, that kind of depends on cultural references to imagery and if that's going to be consistent across who's actually using these. Next slide. And again, whenever we're making any sort of visual choice on the interface, there's a lot of web accessibility standards that we're thinking about when making those choices. Here's a great example of a good tool, color contrast analyzer, that helps anyone who's designing an interface make sure that colors pass for color contrast standards, whether that's large text, small text, or in this case, talking about buttons, kind of graphical components. Next slide, please. So in the case study of me, I'm trying to find this article, followed that bright red suggestion to download it, and now I'd probably expect a pretty clear experience of the follow through. Having a really clean interaction helps us incrementally share information that users need to know as they complete a task, without having to front load a bunch of language that might make someone confused, distracted, or completely turn away from a task. So while there's no like steadfast rule on how many clicks when thinking about web interfaces folks should take, it's important to think about how to center the information that users actually need to take the next step. So if I've identified this article and I'm encouraged to download it for a read, when I select download, I might just be getting the article download, next slide. But in this instance, I actually might be met with a modal that pops up and asks me to accept the terms and conditions of my use on JSTOR. A lot of the time in user experience design across different products, and especially in prisons, I'm sure, it's about negotiating a wealth of different business, legal, emotional types of needs, depending on who the person is that's navigating the interface. So when that happens, it's not a loss that a user has to take that extra click, but in this case, it's important to be mindful about how we're revealing information. If for a legal reason we need to show something like a terms and conditions, we can use the principles we've been talking about to kind of safeguard that experience, to keep someone following that kind of red brick road to accepting and downloading that paper. Or we can also use these hyperlinks to kind of nest information that someone who maybe is looking for a slower path to it and wants a more informed glance of the materials can link out to. So if in my haste, I accepted and downloaded the article I was really excited to read, next slide, I would then find myself with that thoughtful commentary from the original search. All the while hoping that I, as the user, kind of felt trust in the experience so I can return back to it and try it again and again, the more information I want. Next slide. And I'll just note, especially since Stacy was bringing up the tablets, cues that we use in design are always going to differ based on whose experience we actually want to be stewarding and at different times in that journey. And it depends on what kind of pain points they are in their current type of use. So a big part of design is actually understanding what kind of technology someone is using when they're accessing the knowledge. And as designers, we have the opportunity with developers to be scaling that content to match the screen size to make the ultimate experience. And this is an idea called responsive design, which just means if someone's accessing something from a laptop or a desktop, let's say, to access or manage content, that's going to be a different experience than if someone is going to see the same page or a different page in the experience on a very small phone or tablet. So we as designers get to kind of shift images and text that are going to be rescaled and even move parts of the experience up in the hierarchy to make more optimized and accessible navigation for all users. So I'll pass it over to Ryan to talk a little bit more about how the Access in Prisons team used a lot of these design principles to get JSTOR's content into the hands of incarcerated learners.
Thanks, Grace. So there are a few elements of software design that come up sort of in parallel with, or even before we start thinking about the user interface design. And you might think of it as similar to the difference between architectural design and interior design. Until you figured out things like what kind of building it's going to be, or where it's going to be, or what it's going to be made of, it's a challenge to make decisions about paint and furniture. You could end up with a lovely mid-century living room on the 34th floor of your office tower, or a cubicle in your living room. And what we want instead is for the software architecture and user interface to work together. So to begin, we had to figure out some things about the architecture of this software. Is it online or offline? Is it running on a local server or a remote server or on an individual device? Does it allow people to read articles or just search for them? Do administrators and incarcerated learners use the same interface? And don't worry, that is the software architecture diagram.
Yeah.
That's the last software architecture diagram you're going to see. I just wanted an example to illustrate what this sort of planning looks like. While our focus has narrowed a bit over time, the answers to these questions have tended to be all of the above. Most of the incarcerated people with access to JSTOR are using an offline solution. Ron Snyder, who retired from JSTOR Labs in December, built the initial version of this in 2008 after a request from the Barred Prison Initiative. It's a minimal version of the search index designed to fit on a thumb drive, so it contains only the top 500,000 articles, not the full tens of millions. And as of last summer, we're also able to include the full PDFs of 1,500 of the most popular articles on JSTOR, pre-reviewed by librarians with experience in carceral settings. So from an architectural standpoint, this is designed to be as versatile as possible. It can run on pretty much any operating system, almost any hardware. It's small, so it can fit on devices that have very little storage. I've tested it myself on a 10-year-old Windows laptop and on the cheapest Chromebook I could find. And you can even put it on a server and allow people to access it from their devices on a local network. Given what it has to do, it can manage with very little in the way of resources, which is good because very little is usually what's available in prison. While this is still the most popular way to get access inside prisons, it's not the one that's growing fastest. It may not even be the most popular anymore. As Stacy said, people on the inside are increasingly able to get some kind of limited access to the internet. And in some cases, that means people are able to access JSTOR just like anyone outside of prison can. More often, though, the people running prisons have some concerns about what's getting in. It will probably surprise no one to find that the list of things that have been banned in various prisons is long and often absurd. It contains everything from the I Ching, banned in Florida as a threat to the security, order, or rehabilitative objectives of the correctional system, to Windows 10 for Dummies, banned in Oregon for posing a, quote, clear and present danger, to Small Business Taxes 2016, banned in Michigan for including tax forms which, quote, may be used to facilitate fraudulent and criminal activities. Leaving aside the fact that this makes the IRS the most dangerous publisher in America, some of the bigger areas of concern tend to involve pornography as well as material related to escape, drugs, or technology. I suspect that many of you bristle at the idea of providing a tool that makes this kind of censorship easy. I do too. I don't want to build a censorship machine. But even those of us with a certain level of revulsion for that sort of censorship might come up with some cases where we'd want to have some limited ability to restrict access to some content under some circumstances. So there could be an article containing details about the charges, the trial, or even the family life of someone incarcerated in a facility, and letting that article in could endanger their safety. In a prison where white supremacist gangs are a problem, which is a lot of them, you might not want articles that include passages from the Turner Diaries or other Nazi propaganda. Even if the article is contextualizing that content, the part that floats around the facility might be the images rather than the context. So how can you build something that allows some control of what material gets through while still designing things to make sure that as much as possible does become available? To put it another way, can you restrict access without building a censor-o-matic? And I hope that's what we've done with mediated JSTOR. It works a lot like the JSTOR you may be familiar with and a lot like what we just saw in Grace's slides. But there's an additional layer between the reader and the content. And this is online, so there are no limitations on the size of the index. Researchers can look for anything and see exactly the same results they'd get on JSTOR. The difference is that if I find something I want to read here, I can't just download or view the PDF immediately. What I can do is submit a request for access. Administrators authorized by the Departments of Corrections or higher education programs can review requests and approve or deny them. Anything that gets approved by an administrator in a given area, usually it's a state, will immediately and automatically be available to anyone in that area. This is one of the places where we can really take advantage of some of the design techniques that Grace talked about. So for administrators looking at the page, we can make the approve button the primary call to action. That arrow isn't there on the website, though I sometimes wish it were. I'm going to trust Grace that the color and positioning is sufficient. But in addition to making the approve button a more prominent option, we can also make it a one-click action so that all it takes to approve an article is a single click. One click from one administrator and everyone in the state can read it. We also enabled bulk approval of entire journals or disciplines. With 2 clicks, you can approve every single article in Languages and Literature. That's something like 2 million documents. You can even approve the entire corpus with the same 2 clicks. In fact, at least one state has already taken that approach. And doing it that way can benefit everyone, because if everything is pre-approved, no one needs to be managing requests for access. If anything does turn out to be a problem, an administrator can go back later and restrict access to specific documents. But in the meantime, it provides more access for incarcerated people and less work for administrators. But there's another way we can encourage approvals. In addition to making approval prominent and easy, we can also make denials less noticeable and more difficult. It's sort of like how it's very easy to get on a mailing list, but if you want to get off of it, you have to send 3 emails and make a phone call and provide a letter from your primary care physician. We can't make things quite that difficult because we still want departments of corrections to approve this tool. But we've tried to design something that makes it just a little harder to say no than it is to say yes, to build a system where there's a little more friction if you're moving in the direction of restricting access. So the deny button isn't emphasized like the approve button is. And once you click it, instead of immediately getting a notice that the article is denied, you instead get a form to fill out. You'll have to choose the reason you're denying material from a list based on common guidelines in carceral facilities. It also requires additional comments spelling out specifically what's objectionable or where in the document it's located. And finally, it includes a note indicating that there's a record showing who made the denial, what the reason was, and when. And the goal of all this, essentially, is to require that thought be applied to each denial decision, and maybe even a little second guessing. You can't do it in one click. You've got to at least type something, and something is going to let you know that we're noticing who's doing it. I'm going to conclude with a story about why these resources are so valuable to the people inside. I'm formerly incarcerated, and when I was booked into the county jail, they handed me a long sheet of paper with a whole bunch of fine print, laying out rules and policies and procedures. When you can use fingernail clippers, when you can shave, when you can do laundry. Near the top of the list, it said that I would be able to access a library at some point. And other than, oops, our bad, you can leave. That was like the best thing anyone could have said to me on one of the worst days in my life. When I made it down to the dorm where I'd be spending the next few months, well, they called it a pod, not a dorm, which gives it kind of a sci-fi dystopian flair, which it only partially warranted. I had a mattress rolled up under one arm and a pillowcase full of sheets and underwear in the other, and I walked up to the guard desk to ask which cell was mine. And the first thing I asked him was, when will I be able to go to the library? And he just pointed down at his desk. And I said, I'm sorry, I don't understand. Eloquence was not one of his better qualities. He just pointed down at the desk again. So I looked down, and in front of the desk, there's a plastic bin, just like the one Stacy showed you earlier, just like the one you can see on the screen right now. And inside, there were a couple of scraps of paper on the bottom, and like a single page that had fallen out of a mass market paperback. And I realized then that box was the library. Every couple of weeks, everyone would turn in all the books they had, and the boxes would be rotated. And when a new box arrived, dozens of men crowded around it, desperate for anything to help pass the time. Even a book that had cracked apart, where like the whole first half was missing, would be better than staring at the wall for another day. And the box would be empty in seconds, and would mostly stay empty until the guard called for books to be returned for another rotation. The books may not have been what I'd have picked for myself. I read Judy Blume's Summer Sisters and a James Bond novel. I'll always remember a romance novel called The Pirate Next Door, which I never actually got to read because as far as I could tell, the only thing left of it was the cover. I can't tell you what it would have meant to me and those men to have resources like the ones we've talked about today. We didn't have them, and as prisoners will, we made do. But I can tell you that every day inside was a struggle not to come out worse than I was when I went in. And if getting these tools inside has made even one person's struggle a little easier, I count that as a victory. I mentioned that this project started way back in 2008 when someone at the Bard Prison Initiative reached out to someone at JSTOR Labs. And I hope that's a good reminder for all of us. If there's something you want to see, some tool you wish existed, but it doesn't, something you wish was in the world that's not, talk to someone who builds things. It might take 15 years, but it could end up getting 500,000 people and counting access to library resources. And if anyone is wondering who they might reach out to, I will be the first to raise my hand. Reach out to me, feel free. So to wrap up, I just want to take a really quick moment to thank all the people who've worked to make this program happen in JSTOR Labs and JSTOR as a whole, at Ithaca, in higher education programs, especially librarians, and especially the Ascendium Foundation and the Mellon Foundation, whose grants have made this work possible. I would run well past our time if I tried to name everyone involved, but it is really a privilege for me to be able to do this kind of work, and I am deeply grateful to the people and organizations who've made it possible, and also to Stacy and Grace for doing this presentation. And I'd also like to thank all of you, both for listening and for doing the work that you do. So I hope we have time to do some questions and whatnot, but that's it for me.
Actually, we do have time for questions. If anybody would like to put any more questions in the Q&A or would like to put them in the chat, I think we'd be able to accommodate that as well at this point. I think there were 2 questions earlier, but they've already been answered online, I believe. So.
Well, I would like to, the person who was like, who asked a question about the, like, maybe it's just because of the JSTOR cache and that it's, that we get in there. But actually that hasn't been the case. There are a couple of things that are very fascinating as we try to expand this out. One is that many of the program administrators in DOCs weren't coming from education backgrounds. That is starting to change. So many of them came from law enforcement backgrounds. Like they came up, they were corrections officers, and then they moved into administration. And several of them, when I first started just a few years ago, they didn't have college educations and they were in their 50s, 60s. So they weren't familiar with JSTOR at all. They didn't have any contact with it. And so it was a completely foreign thing. And I'd have to educate them about what JSTOR is. And bringing ideas into a facility is dangerous to the status quo. And so all the things that make it so remarkable and integral to education, they're kind of afraid of. So how do you are like, oh, we're just a little library, when it's like we've got a gajillion things for people to read? Like that terrifies them. So a lot of education had to be done about what exactly a digital library is and why they should allow it became secondary. And the second thing that I wanted to mention about that question is the other thing that we discovered was that by making it free, DOCs didn't trust it because they think that spending a lot of money is required for it to be secured. So we wound up having to pass Department of Homeland Security audits. We had to figure out how our servers were like certified to, to FedRAMP certification levels in order to run. And so it made it much more expensive, not that it didn't meet the requirements, but then we had to prove that it met those requirements. And they were more concerned with those components in many states than they were with the content, which was also very interesting. And Aaron, I totally feel your pain. That's my life every day. People without education or library backgrounds evaluating content.
So we have several questions that have come in. For Grace and Ryan, what are some research methodologies you use while preparing your designs?
Yeah, I can start with that and then hand it off to Ryan to talk about the project more specifically. To me, the strongest part of having a good design is having a backbone in user insights, user research. My role in particular kind of mixes them all, but getting to hear exactly what folks' pain points are and kind of making a big map, what we can call like a user journey of what their experience is, starting from can you access articles or not, helps us as a team kind of put together these artifacts that we'll use to reference back to separate users. So when I say user, for example, a Department of Corrections facility officer might be one of those users that we want to map out what's challenging for them, like what do we need to consider, while the other would be an incarcerated student, another could be someone at a higher education program at an institution trying to get access into prisons. So to me, creating those artifacts are really helpful, and also really challenging, which I think I saw Ryan's going to answer something that Anna said, but I think Stacy actually might be able to speak more specifically to someone on our team who is able to do user research with incarcerated students, which can be, I think, a tricky thing to do. But as soon as we have those personas, also is kind of a term that we use in user research to create these real artifacts of real people that create patterns for that type of user. And then I would say in other projects, the way that I approach projects that don't have as much restrictions, I would say, is using kind of a comparative approach to seeing what other products are out there and how those products are also kind of performing, which is a little tougher in this field. I'm also working on another data project. So being able to see how other people are trying to answer the question kind of helps us position ourselves in the landscape. Ryan, if you have anything to add to that.
I think that covered it really well. As you suggested, it is pretty difficult in this particular environment to get a lot of good information on what most of the users are experiencing because, they don't let us just come in and watch them do stuff. But one of the advantages in having designed this so that the user interface for the administrators is very, very similar. It's mostly the same building blocks as the user interface that the students have. So we can get some sense of kind of what's working and what doesn't from the people that we can more easily talk to. And we do occasionally get to hear a little bit from folks who are using or have used it on the inside. So that helps too.
Okay, thank you. And it looks like we have another question there. How many Department of Corrections states do you all have relationships with? In other words, how broad is this project?
So we are in all 50 states. We're not in Puerto Rico, which is a little sad, but we are in the US Virgin Islands and Guam. We're also in 9 military prisons. And in terms of DOCs that we have like directly contracted with, we are at, I think, 17. And the rest of them, even though we're working inside the DOC, we use the agreements of the higher ed program in order to operate. So we're not contracted directly with the DOC. We're using the licensing agreement from the college. And that's because we view all of the students in the prison as just being an extension of the students on the traditional campus. So no additional agreement is required for the licensed material. And that enabled us to scale more quickly because then we didn't have to wait for the DOC to go through procurement, even though it was free, to enable the service to be turned on.
And so this, you may have already addressed this earlier. I might have missed it. Are there any accessibility issues that users have overcome that you're currently working on?
Well, I'll tell you the offline index is not great for accessibility. In order to make it run in a minimal tech environment, where in some facilities, they're using literally 10-year-old Chromebooks that never connect to the internet. They're not designed to store anything. So we had to strip out some of the features that enable, I believe it doesn't have OCR like on it, right, Ryan? It's very minimal. But that's a trade-off because of the minimal tech environment that we're in. As far as the online versions, they meet ADA requirements.
Okay. And Anna was asking, is anyone able to access materials on tablets or otherwise, or is it only available in the labs, libraries for folks who are enrolled in courses? And sorry for all the questions she said.
No, we'll take it. It is available on tablets. That's probably where much of our future expansion growth is going to come from. But the tablet providers have actually been pretty solid once we figured out how we could work with them and to ensure that they were not going to monetize it and charge people for it or pass the costs along to libraries. So yes, we are on tablets. I think I showed you in the one slide what they're increasingly looking like. And we have a pretty large scale, actually a third, we learned this week that a full third of our PEP version for tablets, or a full third of the usage for the PEP version of JSTOR is coming from Massachusetts, which is all tablets. I hope I said that right. Did I say that right, Ryan?
I think that's about right. I can't say that it's a third in general. I can say that it was a third last week.
Fair.
Okay, so what would you like to see next for JSTOR? What the next steps would be if you could? And this is open for all three of you. You can all answer it if you'd like to.
Well, we're seeing a huge uptick in international interest. Last week, particularly was insane. And England and Wales is adopting JSTOR for their 121 facilities, which we did not have on our bingo card. And Basque country in northern Spain, like they have no internet in the village where these 3 prisons are, but they have an offline index. And we're thinking now, what about language? What about content for things that are not like, you know, US centric? The offline index, maybe we could make one possibly in other languages to be more inclusive and to go into other environments that are a lot less techie. And we're thinking about a lot of the lessons that we've learned about access to information inside prisons. Like maybe there are lessons that we've learned here that we can expand out into tribal communities or the global south that have similar technological barriers. Maybe there are ways that we can take these lessons from this really dark, horrible space that we work in and really use it to enlighten and bring light into communities that sometimes we don't think as much about, but have similar barriers to accessing information.
So are they reaching out to you, like Wales and the Basque Country, to try to adopt it over in those areas as well? Is that right?
Yeah, so this is actually really funny, but kind of how my life goes. I met a lady in the elevator at Cornell at a symposium from Ghana who was there to do the hospitality program, and her friend ran a prison in Ghana. And so they got the offline directory and then they started passing it around parts of Africa. And then I went to the ACA in January and I find out it's in Morocco. It's all over there from that one elevator, literally an elevator pitch in Ithaca, New York. We wound up in Morocco. And so it's very much how early JSTOR in the US was inside prisons, when it was just for BPI, and then BPI just kind of passed it around. And if you were affiliated with BPI, they would share the index. And so we're seeing that grassroots kind of approach duplicating itself in other places.
Okay. Are there any other questions for our panelists today? I think this has been very engaging. I think everybody really appreciates it. I'm also impressed with the number of people that are here listening to all these presentations as well, by the way. So this is a credit to everyone here, all the speakers and everyone who's put this together as well. So any other thoughts or anything that you might have thought of? Any questions that kind of, as you're presenting, was there something that came up and said, you know, I would have liked to have discussed this or brought this up? And if not, that's fine. I just
I mean, one thing I will say in writing this, one of the things that I considered a bit was to what extent we can really think of this as an abolitionist project. Because there are some ways in which, of course, it does serve to legitimize existing institutions, which is problematic at best. You know, and I hope, like, just kind of fingers crossed, the extent to which it gives authority and power and information to incarcerated people kind of offsets any other benefits it might have to folks that I would be less thrilled about benefiting. But it's just a thing I'm wrestling with and sort of thought about as I was working on this.
I often think about this work as an abolition one person at a time, because if people don't have access to new ideas and they only come in with the thoughts that they had, they're not exposed to anything new, they don't understand a lot of as much about like they might feel oppressed, they might be experiencing the effects of that all those systemic problems, but they don't understand those forces at play. And giving, I don't mean to sound like giving, like, oh, we're giving this to you, but creating the conditions for them to explore things is really fundamental to restoring their autonomy in a place that is notorious for stripping it. And and so I really feel that when people are also exposed to new information and good information, then they can get mad at the right stuff. And then people stop fighting each other. They stop arguing with each other. And then they can put all of their attention on the things that really need attention. And so I feel like that's really a lot of the value of what we bring.
All right. Well, thank you. I'd like to thank all our presenters and thank you for attending this session. Our next session today is the film screening before time, after time, and it will start within 3:40 on Central Time here. So the same Zoom room, same, and so we encourage you to stick around if you have time. Thank you.